There comes a quiet moment in personal growth when the question shifts. It is no longer, how do I improve myself, but rather, what kind of presence do I bring into the lives of others? In that moment, growth stops being a private project and becomes a relational one. The measure of a life begins to include not only achievements, but atmosphere, the emotional climate one carries into a room, a conversation, or a shared silence. A loving presence is not something grand or theatrical. It is not defined by dramatic generosity or constant cheer. More often, it appears in subtle ways, the way someone listens without interrupting, the patience they offer when tensions rise, the steadiness they bring when others feel unmoored. It lives in tone of voice, in posture, in the quality of attention that says, "You are safe to be here as you are." There is a quiet power in emotional steadiness. Research into human behavior suggests that moods ripple outward, influencing families, workplaces, and communities in ways we rarely notice. A single grounded person can soften an entire group's anxiety. Likewise, one reactive or chronically agitated presence can unsettle many. In this sense, cultivating inner stability is not self-indulgence, it is a form of service. To become a loving presence does not mean becoming endlessly accommodating. Love is not synonymous with compliance. True care includes discernment, honesty, and boundaries. It means learning when to say yes with warmth, when to say no with clarity, and when to pause before reacting. Love, at its most mature, does not erase the self, it expresses it with wisdom. There is a misconception that love requires constant emotional openness or perpetual positivity. In reality, a loving presence is often grounded in the courage to remain present even when emotions are complex, uncomfortable, or unresolved. It is the ability to sit with another person's pain without trying to fix it prematurely, to witness confusion without rushing toward easy answers, to allow silence without filling it with nervous words. A person who cultivates love inwardly begins to move through the world with a gentler lens. Irritation softens. Judgments loosen. Curiosity replaces defensiveness. The mind becomes less interested in winning arguments and more interested in understanding perspectives. This does not mean conflict disappears, but it transforms in tone, from battle to dialogue, from opposition to exploration. Love practiced inwardly reshapes perception. When one learns to extend patience toward one's own imperfections, it becomes easier to grant patience to others. When self-criticism softens, compassion naturally expands. Over time, this internal shift alters how people are seen, not as obstacles or competitors, but as fellow travelers navigating uncertainty in their own imperfect ways. To be a loving presence is, in part, to learn the art of emotional regulation. This does not imply suppression or denial of feelings, but rather the ability to experience emotions without being ruled by them. When anger arises, it is noticed before it turns into harm. When fear surfaces, it is acknowledged before it hardens into hostility. Emotional maturity allows responses to emerge from awareness rather than impulse. There is a subtle dignity in someone who can pause before reacting. That pause, brief as it may be, it creates space for wisdom. In that space, one can choose curiosity over accusation, reflection over retaliation, care over control. Over time, these small pauses accumulate, shaping a presence that feels safe, thoughtful, and trustworthy. A loving presence also grows from the willingness to remain open in the face of discomfort. Rather than retreating into numbness or defensiveness, one learns to stay present with uncertainty, grief, disappointment, or interpersonal tension. This openness does not eliminate pain, but it prevents pain from hardening into bitterness. It keeps the heart responsive rather than armored. This kind of openness requires courage. It is easier to close down, to label others, to withdraw, or to build emotional walls. Remaining open means accepting vulnerability, the possibility of being misunderstood, disappointed, or hurt. Yet it is precisely this vulnerability that allows authentic connection to exist at all. Over time, identity itself can soften. Instead of clinging tightly to a fixed self-image, roles, opinions, reputations, one begins to experience identity as more fluid. The self feels less like a rigid structure and more like a living process. This flexibility makes empathy easier because one no longer needs to defend a fragile ego at every turn. As identity loosens, love becomes less conditional. It is no longer dependent on whether others meet expectations, affirm beliefs, or behave predictably. Instead, love becomes a stance toward reality itself, an orientation of goodwill, patience, and respect toward the unpredictable flow of human life. A loving presence does not mean being free of flaws. It means being honest about them. There will be moments of impatience, defensiveness, or misjudgment. The difference lies not in avoiding mistakes, but in how one responds afterward. Can we acknowledge harm when it occurs? Can we apologize without self-justification? Can we return to awareness and begin again? There is quiet strength in someone who can repair rather than deny. Repair restores trust more effectively than perfection ever could. It teaches others that growth is possible, that relationships can survive rupture, that humility is more powerful than pride. A loving presence expresses itself not only in personal relationships, but in everyday interactions, with strangers, colleagues, family members, and even oneself. It shapes how one drives in traffic, responds to inconvenience, handles disagreement, and navigates moments of boredom or frustration. Love, in this sense, is not an abstract ideal but a daily practice embedded in ordinary moments. It can be felt in the way someone waits their turn to speak, in how they acknowledge another person's effort, in how they choose words that heal rather than wound, in how they remain attentive even when they have nothing to gain. These small acts rarely draw attention, yet they accumulate into a reputation for kindness, steadiness, and integrity. There is also a broader dimension. A loving presence influences culture. It affects workplaces, communities, families, and social systems. It can de-escalate conflict, encourage cooperation, and inspire others to soften their own defenses. Love, when embodied consistently, becomes quietly contagious. Over time, living as a loving presence transforms the experience of life itself. The world feels less adversarial and more relational. Challenges still arise, but they are met with curiosity rather than hostility. Differences still exist, but they become opportunities for understanding rather than threats. This way of living does not promise ease. In fact, it often requires greater awareness, responsibility, and emotional effort. But it offers something deeper than comfort, a sense of coherence, meaning, and connection. It allows one to feel woven into the fabric of life rather than standing apart from it. To live lovingly is not to become saintly or self-sacrificing in unhealthy ways. It is to become awake to one's impact, to recognize that every interaction leaves a trace, that every response shapes a shared reality. It is to choose, again and again, to contribute clarity rather than confusion, warmth rather than coldness, presence rather than absence. In the end, a loving presence is less about trying to be good and more about being real. Real in listening. Real in accountability. Real in care. Real in vulnerability. Love ceases to be a concept and becomes an atmosphere, something felt rather than proclaimed. And perhaps this is one of the quiet truths of growth, that the most meaningful legacy we leave behind is not what we accumulate or achieve, but the quality of presence we offered while we were here.